So what I want to argue is that we're artifacts as well, loaded with embedded values. We're born into a society with values. We're reared in families with values. And we get education that has certain kinds of values. And just keep on going on this list. So any claim that we ought to follow our conscience or our internal compass is mistaken. As in, when you follow your internal compass, your leadership is authentic. I was going to give a paper on a far different topic, and then I read the book for this course, and I got really pissed off, excuse me. I don't think your book is a very good book, and I will try to explain why I don't think it's a very good book, because I think its central thesis is wrong and wrong-headed. So let's go explain why. Since our internal compass is a value-laden artifact, it can't provide moral guidance. We would need to assess the values that are embedded in it by some independent standard. Besides, it's what I call tensed. It lacks the coherence any proper moral guide needs. And we can see this by looking at 4 features we've come to have. We learn to think like an X and put anything you want in for an X, lawyer, doctor, Indian chief, whatever. We end up wearing 2 or more hats throughout our lives. We're trying to live a life while we're doing all these other things. And any profession you enter is going to have internal tensions. So let me go through each of these at a somewhat rapid pace. Learning to think like an X. One of the nice things to do if you want to learn about a profession is to look at the jokes that professionals tell about other professions. So my favorite engineering joke is the one about the engineer, you know this one, the one about the engineer and the priest and the doctor who are about to be guillotined. And the priest goes up and they pull the lever and nothing happens. And they say, God doesn't want us to guillotine a priest, so he walks away, actually runs away. The doctor goes up, they pull the lever, same thing happens, no blade. So he gets up, it's another miracle. Third man walks up, he's the engineer. His head's going underneath, and as it goes underneath, he looks up and he says, wait, I think I see the problem. You learn how to think like an engineer, and it becomes so second nature, you can't help yourself, even when it means your head in this case, all right? Philosophers and arguments, just to give one about myself. One of the things I learned early on is to lose all sense of ego about the arguments that I give as a philosopher. What you do is you learn to take an argument, somebody gives it, and you basically just take it away and you put it up on the wall, and then you look at it and you say things like, geez, this is really stupid. First place, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises you've got. So you're missing a premise somewhere. But the premise it looks like you're missing doesn't make any sense. It would be this, and that's clearly false. Besides that, if that's not false, the first premise is false. Either that or it's absurd. And I very quickly discovered, I was lucky I discovered it quickly, after I became a faculty member, that the colleagues on the committees that I was on from different departments, not philosophers, really didn't appreciate my helping them in that way. They would give me arguments, for example, about why a student ought to be given something instead of something else. And I would say, geez, take the argument, put it up on the board, as it were, and say, that's really the argument, and then go through and show why it was shitty. And I was very unsuccessful. I learned a technique. And the technique I learned was very unhelpful. That way of thinking didn't help me, as it were, advance the cause, in this case, of students. Third example, I'll just be very brief about this. There's a very famous book called by Fehrenbacher on the Dred Scott case, the 1857 case. And you don't need to know why I got interested in this case, but I've done an enormous amount of work on it. And what struck me about the book, which I think is completely wrong-headed, even though it won the Pulitzer, is that he says the Dred Scott case had no significance at all. It made no difference at all. And the measure he gives of that is that he looks at the electoral results in 1856, And then he looks at the electoral results in 1858, and there's almost no difference. So clearly, if you're going to measure the results of this case by the electoral outcome, you get no effect. And so, of course, it lacks all significance. And the objection I want to make to that is he's a political scientist, and he's looking at the wrong thing. Because what he ought to be looking at is what this did to the possibility of freeing the slaves through any kind of constitutional process. Effectively, what this did, it was if you're an abolitionist and you want to change the Constitution to get rid of slavery, before Dred Scott, there was a possibility of going to Congress or going to the Supreme Court to get it changed. After Dred Scott, those two possibilities were ruled out. This means if you were opposed to slavery, the only way you could possibly get it done would be through a constitutional amendment. And given the numbers needed for a constitutional amendment, we would need 76 states in the Union to be able to get enough, given how many votes, how many southern states there were. I learned in the process of doing this that Texas, which I didn't know, retained the right to divide itself into 5 slave states at any time in the future. So if worse came to worse, and there were many, many northern states, Texas would divide itself into 5 states and thus increase the number needed for a constitutional amendment. So when I look at something like Fehrenbacher, I see his work, I see him thinking like a political scientist and failing to see the wider picture and understand the significance of the Dred Scott case. So that's learning how to think like an X. The second kind of problem, and the thrust of that is, we learn to see things in a certain way, and we want people to learn to see things in a certain way. We want people to think like engineers if they go to engineering college. We want them to think like a lawyer if they get a law degree. If they fail to do that, we haven't succeeded in teaching them properly. The second thing that happens is people end up wearing 2 hats, and this is a very famous example. I'm now no longer convinced it's actually correct, but it's such a wonderful example, I'm going to use it anyway. This is the Challenger case, and there are lots of problems with the Challenger. Here's one of them. That's the Challenger launch pad, the morning of the launch. Notice the ice all over it. It rained the night before, and the temperature was projected to drop down to 18 degrees. So they turned on all the water so it wouldn't freeze. And that's what you ended up with. That's the control panel for the launch pad, covered with ice. This was at 6 a.m. on the morning of the launch. Hard to justify launching under these circumstances. Background for the teleconference the night before the launch. I don't know what you know about the Challenger or remember about this at all, probably most of you. Was anybody see this in school? You're too young to have seen this in school, right? I'm getting older and older. It's getting worse and worse. The rocket boosters for the shuttles are made of, it's like stacked pieces. And the example I use is you take these coffee cups that come down and then they go in and they go like this across the bottom and you can stack them on top. Suppose you wanted a really big coffee cup. So you take 3 of these cups and you take out the bottom, right? And then you stack them on top of each other. So you get a cup that's 4 cups high. Well, you pour coffee in it, what's going to happen? It's all going to come out the sides, right? So what you need is something to keep that from happening. So you put rubber bands inside each segment and you stick them on top, and that's going to seal it. Well, that's effectively how the shuttle boosters are made. They are stacked on top of each other, bolted together, and then there's something called an O-ring. There are actually 2 of them, and the O-ring is supposed to keep the gases that explode inside from coming through the side of the booster rocket. What happens when the booster rocket goes off is exactly what happens when you lift up that cup of coffee. And it has a nice technical name. It's called twang. I love that name. It basically vibrates. So you pick up the bottom of the cup of coffee, and the whole thing's going to vibrate a little bit. Well, as it vibrates, the segments of the booster rocket move back and forth, causing, as it were, spillage if you had coffee in it. But if you have a booster rocket, it's 1,000 psi's pressure, 1,000 plus, I guess, psi's pressure, you've got to worry about something coming through the side. What they had in there were the 2 O-rings for each booster segment made of Viton. And Viton is like rubber, and it's supposed to respond really fast to pressure. So when the twang occurs, you put pressure on the O-ring, it instantly bounces back up. See, it's going to be on one side and pop up on the other. It's going to bounce up and take the place and seal it, and you don't get any blow-by. You don't get anything going through. Well, the night before the launch, the temperature was going to be 18 degrees, they thought. The Viton was certified down to 25, and NASA wanted permission from Morton Thiokol to launch. And they wanted permission because you can't launch against a main contractor's refusal to allow a launch. And because this was outside the certification range of the Viton, they needed Morton Thiokol's permission to launch. So the engineers at Morton Thiokol recommended there be no launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a reason for that. We can talk about it later if you want to. That's the calculated temperature of the O-rings of the flight the previous January, where they had basically burn through of the first O-ring and impingement of the second O-ring. NASA didn't like that recommendation. They asked for basically a new recommendation. And the managers at Morton Thiokol basically got together and decided on their own to overrule their engineers. And the crucial moment came when, I think the crucial moment came when Bob Lund, who was the vice president for engineering, was told to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat. And when he did that, he changed his mind. As an engineer, he had agreed that the Challenger should not launch. And as a manager, he agreed with the management team that it ought to launch. What was different? He changed the way he looked at the problem. And he changed the decision procedure he had used as an engineer. This is going to put it much too simply. But engineers are risk averse. Failure was a risk and would have been catastrophic. So no launch. Managers use cost-benefit analyses. Catastrophic failure seemed unlikely. I mean, it wasn't a likely event. But failing to launch would almost certainly have had severe consequences. So they launch. Let me talk about the consequences just very briefly. The previous week, NASA had sent out a bid for new booster rockets. And instead of going directly to Morton Thiokol, they'd opened it up to everybody. Partly because they were not happy with the way Morton Thiokol had been proceeding very slowly. Second, NASA's hearings for a budget were the next day. And they were already under enormous pressure because this was only the 26th or 24th launch. It should have been the 125th launch. When they started this program, they said basically they're going to be launching every 2 weeks. It failed to do that. The third rather crucial feature was this was the Teacher in Space shuttle. And the President, Reagan, was giving this talk of the Union talk that night. And the assumption was that he would call the Teacher in Space and they would have a chat on live TV. And that would obviously be a big coup both for NASA and for the President. So they had lots of reasons not to postpone this launch, but to launch. And if you weigh all of that in the balance, talk about the cost of failure is catastrophic, but the likelihood is so small. But the likelihood of these other things happening is actually quite high, and they're pretty bad for the people who are involved in it. So you're wearing two hats. We train people to wear a hat, as it were. So engineers think like engineers, physicians like physicians, and so on. But learning to think like an X can blind us to other ways of thinking. And that's what happened, according to Bob Lund, that's what happened to him the night before the Challenger loss. You don't see things with virgin eyes. Think of the engineering example, the guillotine. You can't see things, as it were, anew, as though you hadn't seen them before. You're going to see this guillotine as an engineering problem. So, learning to think like an X is not morally neutral. I won't say that seeing everything like engineers is bad. I'll let their spouses and children make that judgment. Clearly, we carry ourselves in the world in different ways, and those are not morally neutral. Well, here's a true story about a philosopher. I might as well pick on my own profession. Professor saw a boy who looked like one of his colleagues. Is your dad Professor Millett? Yes. He teaches philosophy? Yes. Does he talk to you? Yes, he does. You poor bastard. That's translated exactly right. That's exactly what he said. As my wife and children will tell you, living with a philosopher can be a trial. And their standard example is, I'm always saying, aren't you missing a premise? It gets tiring after a while. So, learning to think like an X and wearing two hats, we're trained in to come to see the world in different ways, and because we don't always wear one hat, often don't, and switching's not easy. Third feature, living a life. Just to pick an example, the nation's Catholic bishop said in 1998 that faithful and serious Catholic public officials cannot advocate or support direct attacks on human life. They really were asking, how can Senator Kennedy live with himself? Because he was a Catholic and he was supportive of abortion rights. Ultimately, Francis Cardinal George said, the conflict is not between the bishops and the politicians. The conflict is between politicians and their own faith, and that's an internal conflict. It's internal to them. I won't pursue the problems here, but you can see the difficulty. How can we make consistent all that we take on in our lives? As a representative and a Catholic, for Kennedy, but for all of us, as a child, parent, citizen, professional, and so on. I don't know if you can see the joke here. On the bright side, ever since the layoff and my divorce, it's been much easier to balance work and family. Okay? I mean, this is something we're all into. We all do this all the time, and it gets worse. It doesn't get any better, as I tell my children, the older you get. So we're all familiar with these tensions produced by competing demands, and the tensions are internal to us. They define us. This is what we are. So we all learn to think like an X. We all end up wearing two or more hats, and we all have lives with competing, what I would call competing moral relations. So we need to add one more. Learning to think like an X is not learning to think in just one way, because professions have their own internal tensions. And this is one of my favorite examples. I had a colleague at Michigan State. Michigan State has a med school, which is a very strange med school. It's a result of a compromise between the University of Michigan Medical School and the Michigan Legislature. When Michigan State asked for a med school, University of Michigan Med School said, no way. We're the med school in the state of Michigan. But the legislative weight was in favor of a med school, so they came up with a compromise. Compromise was they could have a med school, but not have any physicians or hospital or anything else associated with a med school. They would basically, the students would go to Michigan State for 2 years, taking courses from professors that would be brought in from outside in medicine, and then they'd be farmed out all over the state to various hospitals. And the physicians at those hospitals would become adjunct professors at Michigan State University and teach them medicine. So you wouldn't have any extra money having to go to Michigan State that otherwise could have gone to the University of Michigan. Okay? Very straightforward. Typical compromise. My colleague's sitting one spring day in his office, and he hears tittering in the hall. People sort of smiling, laughing, and he thinks it's spring. A couple's out in the hall messing around. And it doesn't stop, so he gets up and looks out. There's nobody there. And then he realizes it's coming from down the hall. So he walks down the hall, looks into a classroom. The door's open in this classroom. And there are 10 little booths, I guess, separated by canvas, like curtains for a shower. Well, what's happening is there are 20 med students. This is the spring quarter of their second year. It's their last quarter. And they are learning how to examine patients. And they're learning by examining each other. Now think about it for a minute. You go into a physician and you have to strip because you're going to have a physical. The last thing you want is to have your physician go, excuse me, I'm sorry. No, it's all right. It's perfectly okay. I'm not laughing at you, really. One of the things that happens is when we see somebody else nude, we tend to get embarrassed about this, and the embarrassment comes through by our laughing about it. So what they were learning how to do is to examine other human beings as though the human beings were bicycles almost. Mechanisms, all right? Not persons. And yet these 20 people had basically been going through school together for 2 years. Some had dated and broken up. Some had wanted to date but had never been able to quite bring themselves to do it, okay? And as happens over 2 years with 20 people, you're going to get animosities and all kinds of things going on. And yet you've got to look at this person as though this person were a bicycle, because that's what you want to be able to do as a professional. At the same time, you want physicians who have a decent bedside manner, who actually relate to you as a person. Okay, I don't want to look at you like a bicycle. I want to look at you like a person and talk to you. Are you okay? See, he's just going to smile at me, kind of embarrassed. And that's what you don't want in a physician. Not that I'm picking on you, but I was because you were there. What's happening here? We have a profession that has an internal conflict. A physician has to play at least 2 roles which can't well be played together. That of looking at a person as a person, and that of looking at a person as though it were a mechanism. And treating the person as a mechanism when that's appropriate, and treating the person as a person when that's appropriate. Second example, real fast, is lawyers who are both officers of the court and prosecuting or defense attorneys. And the standard example of this is you have a client who claims to be innocent, hasn't committed the crime in question. There's really good evidence against him. And you've decided he shouldn't go on the stand because he's not very believable. At the last minute, he says he's going to go on. You can't prevent him from doing that. And then he tells you he's going to lie. And you try to convince him, this is really stupid. They're going to find out. They're going to catch you in this, and then you're going to go to jail because you lied about this. But you can't. So what do? Well, you're the client's attorney. There's a privileged relationship here, and he's giving you some information which is privileged. And so he has a right to expect that you not say anything about this. On the other hand, you're an officer of the court. And it's part of your job to ensure the integrity of the legal process. And you are going to permit your client to go up when on the stand and tell a lie, even though you know that's going to happen. So what do? Well, if you decide to go to the judge and tell the judge about it, there'll be a mistrial because you can no longer function as this person's attorney. And there'll have to be another trial, more expense, and your client, if he's smart enough, will have learned something. Don't tell your lawyer the next time. Just go and lie, okay? Or if you want to lay it out farther, tell your lawyer. So the question is, this is a serious problem in law. The particular regulation in legal ethics has been changed over and over again over the last 30 years or so because people can't decide what the obligations of lawyers are in this case. It's a complicated situation. Why is this not going? Here we go, because I'm pushing the wrong one. I think we ought to presume that every profession is in every X is intention, and so that thinking like an X doesn't itself guarantee coherence. So we're artifacts. This is what we've learned so far. With embedded values, we're not likely to notice. The values are intention. And we see ourselves with value-laden eyes, not virgin eyes. And the example I want you to keep in mind about this is the engineer in the guillotine. He cannot look at that objectively as someone who's about to be guillotined. He looks at it like an engineer. So when you look at yourself, you're going to look at yourself with the value-laden eyes that you've come to have because of who you are. What society you're born into, what education you've had, what family you've been into, what profession you've come into. You're not going to see yourself with virgin eyes. So it makes no moral sense at all to tell us to follow our conscience or our inner compass. We should do that only if we are in what I call the moral zone, immune to every sort of moral criticism. And we obviously can't determine that by appealing to our inner compass. We need some independent way of making that determination. We need an independent criterion each time we make a decision with moral implications. And we make such decisions our whole life long as we take on new rules and meet new problems. We can determine what's best only by an appeal to independent standards. So let's go back and look at one last example that illustrates how artifacts embody values and that raises the question, what's best? That's what I began with. I don't know whether anybody paid attention to it or not. Any idea what it is? Yes.
Is it a old design for a pencil?
A pencil. Why do you say it's a pencil?
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, but I know that. Well, I mean, what about the way it looks makes you think it's a pencil? The point here?
Well, with the second photo there, when you have your finger on it, looks like it's obviously a long object.
With a point at the end.
And then with the bottom and top photo, it looks like kind of the center part of it is made of a dark material that comes to a point.
Would you think it's a pen a pencil or a pen? I mean, I would
think based on that tip that it's a pencil.
Pencil, okay. All right, so okay, pencil. What about the propellers? I mean, it's got propellers. That isn't really, I guess, a propeller, but it looks like it could have propellers on the top.
That was like the sharpener.
Oh, that's the sharpener?
Yeah.
So it's not like a beanie or something you could, okay. Propeller beanie. Any other guesses? Suggestions? Yes?
I thought it was like a boat.
A what?
A boat.
A boat? Sorry, a boat. Okay, the good idea. A boat. How could he get boat out of this? What? Upside with the top one? Oh, I see. This one. Oh, right. I see it now. Good eye. That's great. And then, so what's the? Okay, if that's a boat, what about this one drawing then? I mean, because isn't that the keel? I mean, if you're looking at this, aren't you looking at the slice across here? But then when you look at this, the keel is this tiny little pointed. I mean, it's completely at odds with his suggestion. I mean, it's a very tiny boat with a really tiny little keel. So, I mean, do you have a response or?
Well, I mean, it's kind of
could be a rudder.
Yeah.
Okay, possible rudder. What?
Well, the figure or the numbers are correlate.
The numbers don't correlate.
No, they do.
Yeah, it's so 12 and 12.
Yeah, 7, 6, and 8. It looks like it's a circular point.
7, 6. I don't even see 7. 6, 8, and 7.
And then on the bottom.
Oh, I see. 6, 7, and 8. Okay, right. So it's got to be the same. It can't be a keel and a rudder. It has to be the same thing.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. Good move. And 12, this has to be this. I have no idea what this little thing is, this line. Any other suggestions? Are you raising your hand to... No, she backs off instantly. I can't see your name, so I don't know who you are. No ideas at all? About what it could be? Don't look away. I'm looking at you.
Me?
Yeah, you. Yes. Any ideas at all about what it could be?
At first I thought it was a dirigible.
A dirigible. Okay. And now what do you think?
I was going like this because I was like moving that piece 12.
Oh, I thought you might be doing that. And what does it look like when you move it?
I'm so confused about where it goes.
Any other? Yes.
Could it be the needle end of a old record player?
Oh, that's a very good suggestion. Yeah. No, it's not. But I mean, you're onto something. It's like a point, a needle point. Any other ideas? You want me to tell you what it is? Yeah. Okay. I hate to tell you this. It's a toothpick.
Yeah, I should have seen that.
It was patented in 1921, and that little object, number 12, you remember the big thing? That's your tongue. This is a toothpick that fits on the end of your tongue. Now, wait, you got to understand the rationale for this. If you get a toothpick and you're working on it, it's really hard to get inside, isn't it? I mean, you get on the outside pretty well, but getting inside, you got to really maneuver it around. So if you take your tongue and you move your tongue inside your mouth all over the place, can't you move it on every single tooth? Yep. And if you had a little pointed thing at the end, you could actually get all the little crevices on the inside. And dangerous? What makes you think it's dangerous?
If you start talking or like chewing, it might like...
Oh, you think you might swallow it by accident?
No, like start talking or like it might...
Oh, I see. You would scar the inside of your... Oh. I was actually thinking the danger would be that you might actually swallow it by accident. In which case, you've got this very sharp pointed thing going through some very delicate parts of your body and then eventually coming out a very delicate part of your body. It seems a little, but I hadn't thought about the scarring of your inside of your mouth. Yeah, it might make, it's possible. Would anybody use this? Who in this class would use this? Huh?
If they had it at like a restaurant.
If they had it at a restaurant, you'd use it? If they gave you one free, you would use it? Do you want a toothpick? I've got a toothpick. You're really into free stuff tonight. You actually would use this? It doesn't make you nervous to use it?
I'd probably be careful.
Be careful. That's what they all say. That's how, I'll be careful. And then you have an accident.
Maybe if you had like a lanyard on it.
Huh?
Maybe if you had like a lanyard on it.
Part of what I'm illustrating here, and again, I have to thank Petrotsky for this. If you compare this toothpick to the one with the ones we usually use with 2 points at the end, with the Japanese one, think about the different values that are being embedded in these toothpicks and the different effects of these things. I hadn't thought about cutting yourself inside your mouth. It never had occurred to me. My worry would be using this thing. I've never done this comparison, never thought about it. I really don't want to do it here, but when you see people talking, if you'll sort of look at the size of their tongue, do it without drawing too much attention. I mean, because it's, when you stare at, can you put your tongue out, please? When you stare at somebody's tongue, it's a little disconcerting, okay? But people have different sized tongues. What are you going to do? Sell different size toothpicks? And how do you make it stick on to make sure it stays? I mean, I have no idea how this would work. Yes?
Maybe rubber band it, kind of like,
Put a rubber band on your tongue?
I don't know if this is permanent or not, you know.
Is what permanent?
It's permanent?
No, it's to be
So
used,
we just
yeah.
take it off.
Yes, well, that would be, if it were permanent, that would be interesting. No, I was actually thinking, I don't know how you would get it on with a rubber band to put it.
Like casing that stretches.
Oh, you mean like the end would stretch? Boy, talk about being embarrassed by using a toothpick. Excuse me, I have to use my toothpick. And then stretching it up and putting it on. Yeah, okay. Well, there's a different value. Right, we've got a different value. But the thrust of this, the main point of it is, look at how you've got a simple little thing, a toothpick, and I've given you 3 different examples. I'm sure there are many, many more, all of which are different. They all have different values, and we assess them in terms of what we see about these things. This one looks dangerous. The Japanese one looks like it really has health benefits if people would use it correctly. I suspect, has anybody ever used that toothpick correctly here? You have? Oh, it's not fair. Are you Japanese?
No.
Okay, all right. I thought maybe you were, and that's just not fair, okay. How come you used it correctly?
I read his book.
Oh, you read his book? Good for you. I have to tell. I have to tell a story here. I won $10 because of this book. I'm at a philosopher's party of all places, and somebody holds up this toothpick. A colleague of mine and says, "This is a weird toothpick." And I said, "Well, it's not just a toothpick." And then I showed how it works. And he said, "How'd you know that?" And I said, "Well, I read it in a book." "What book?" I said, "A book, The Toothpick by Petrotsky." "There's no book. You just made it up, didn't you?" I said, no, there really is a book. I bet you $10. So I won $10 all of this. There actually is a book that shows this. Well, that's good. I'm glad you read that. It's a good book.
Can you show someone how this works by putting it on your...
No. Not this toothpick. No. This one. We were at a cocktail party for philosophers, and this was stuck into the cheese. And so he had used it to clean his teeth. And I basically said, "You're not using it correctly." And he looked at it and he said, "It's kind of a neat toothpick." And then I showed him how to use it. And then I won $10 because he doesn't believe there's actually a book called The Toothpick. All right, we're done in terms of the point I wanted to make. Discussion. Yes?
What your main thrust was that we should evaluate our moral dilemmas by an independent standard. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts of what an independent standard is,
Well,
how an independent standard is used, and how you can decontextualize.
Well, can I attack your question first?
Of course.
Okay, good. I actually don't think that the most moral problems we have are not moral dilemmas. There are various kinds of moral problems we have, and one of the most, two of the most interesting are what I call, well, let me put it this way. There are conceptual problems and there are temporal problems. And I'll give you a conceptual example I'll give you a real case where both of these problems come to the fore. And this actually comes out of my work in social work ethics. What we did was collect a bunch of real cases by social workers who were having serious problems. So this is a case in a small town. A man comes home from work. His wife, they have 3 kids. One is an infant. She asks him when he comes in the door to sit on the bed and watch the infant while she goes and changes the diapers of the other 2. They're like 3, 2, and 6 months. Who would do this? I don't know, but still. So she goes and changes the diapers, and she comes back in, and she finds that her husband, who's a very big man, has fallen asleep on the bed. And he's also fallen asleep on the infant, who is now not breathing. So they call 911 and they helicopter medevac the baby to a local hospital. It's about 20 miles away. And they get the baby there, and clearly the baby's going to die. There's no way it can be saved. It's been deprived of oxygen for way too long. Right? They, meaning the hospital, assume that this is a SIDS death, sudden infant death syndrome. You know, they said, well, the baby was on the bed, blah, blah, blah. You know, they're pretty frantic. So the doctor just takes all of this in, and the nurse takes all of this in, and the social worker gets called in because the family is unbelievably distraught. This happens on a Wednesday afternoon about 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. The baby gets to the hospital at 6. The next morning, the family's still there, and this will be Thursday morning, and they're just so distraught, the social workers to come in and try to help them. As she's talking to them, she discovers that the husband fell asleep on the baby. Well, this makes it not sudden infant death syndrome. This makes it something completely different. And now the question is, why? I mean, what happened that caused him to do this? If it was done intentionally by him, that puts the other children at risk. And this was a Michigan case. Michigan state law requires that she report this. Once it's reported, the other 2 children will be taken from the house, from the home. They'll be gone at least 6 months while the family's investigated. And then, if everything's okay, they'll be given back to the family. But 6 months for a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, that's a long time. And the family's life in this little town are going to be ruined. I mean, you know, they're going to have, even if everything turns out okay and they find that, you know, it didn't happen the way they thought it might have happened, the rumor will always be there. You know, they lost the youngest because, well, you know why they lost it, and that'll be the nature of their relationship to their neighbors and everybody else in the town. On the other hand, she has no proof that he didn't just fall asleep, and maybe he's got some kind of problem. So she gets on the phone and she starts calling. This is Thursday afternoon. And she discovers he's a model worker. He does drink, but not a lot. Has a couple of beers. He might have had a couple of beers before he came home that day. She doesn't know. He doesn't remember. He's so distraught he can't remember. And they don't know that she's actually doing this kind of investigative work. She's asked a bunch of questions, she says, to fill out forms and stuff, and then she goes and does a lot of work that she can do. She talks to his employer, who now knows that there's an investigation going on, so already the word's going to leak out in a small town. And she calls the doctor, and the doctor says, I'm sorry, I can't, you know, confidentiality. There's no time in which she could get a court order to get him to disclose anything. But she talks around, and by the time she's done, which is basically Friday mid-afternoon, she can't decide. She doesn't have enough information to be able to say whether this was purely accidental or whether it was intentional. There's no history of abuse in the family, but on the other hand, you get 3 kids in 3 years. You're going to crack eventually here. I mean, something might give. And the other question is, how could you possibly fall asleep on an infant and not feel that? I mean, the infant was pretty big size. It was a 9-pound baby, which is huge, all right? And by the time this guy fell asleep on her, it weighed almost 14 pounds. So that's a good chunk of, shouldn't talk about the baby as a chunk of something, but it's a very large package, as it were. And he fell asleep on this thing and didn't realize he was doing it. That seems really counterintuitive. Now, what's the moral problem she has? Well, she does, in a sense, have a dilemma. She has to either tell the authorities or not. If she tells the authorities, the law takes over and the other children get, okay. But there's an investigation, and presumably they have more time to find stuff out, and maybe they'll find something out. If she doesn't tell them, then either one of 2 things is going to happen. Either everything's going to be okay, except they've lost the infant, Or somewhere down the road, they may lose another one, okay? Or something else may happen. And if that happens, then she'll feel horrible about it, but it probably will have an effect on her job and her reputation and so on. Problem is she has no time to get the information she needs in order to make a decision. And she has to do something. So she has a dilemma, but the problem isn't the dilemma. The problem is the lack of time. And in this case, the lack of resources to do this. So when you ask the question, how do you handle ethical dilemmas? I'm like, okay, they're not all dilemmas. Sometimes there's something different. The other example, most of you are not parents, I take it. Some of you are. When I do this with social workers and I ask, how many parents, well, I should ask you, kids, when you won't remember, but maybe your parents have told you, do you know whether your parents ever had you in their beds when you were an infant? Does anybody know that? Yeah? Your mother or father had you in their bed when you were small? No, I was looking at Katie. Because she said yes.
Yeah, they did.
They did.
Or they had my sister.
Or they had to sit, they didn't take you into bed? Is this some kind of prejudice?
Like when I was a baby.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Well,
When you were in,
well,
you know.
I used to like climb in my parents' bed.
Okay, but you, when you, I'm actually talking about when you were small, an infant, unable to do that. How many people would do that? Yeah.
I know my parents would have me in bed occasionally.
Okay, there you go. There's one. I get a mixed response. It's almost 50-50. I get half the people saying, there's no way, because something bad could happen. And the other half saying, are you crazy? It's a little kid, and it's your kid, and it's crying, and it needs comforting. And I'm the mother, damned if I'm going to not have this kid in my bed. What's interesting is what they're arguing about is what constitutes due care. What is due care in regard to a parent and an infant in regard to having the infant in the bed? Is it putting it in the bed next to you so it can get comforted? Is it not putting it in the bed next to you so it won't get... And that's what I call a conceptual disagreement. A lot of moral problems are like that. They don't get solved by more facts. They get solved by a discussion of what constitutes due care, in which you might disagree. So what you're asking for is what independent standards we have. Well, that's another paper, but I'll give you a very quick response to it. I referred to two things here. I gave the example of the toothpicks, partly because we really can understand how the values that are, as it were, embedded in the toothpick lead to different beneficial and non-beneficial effects. So the problem with the one that goes on your tongue, I mean, besides the embarrassment of trying to get it on, there's the real danger of it slipping off and you're swallowing it. How many people have swallowed gum by accident? Almost everybody in the class. So, why did you do it? Coughed, something happened, you got surprised, some friend came up and slapped you on the back. Well, I mean, suppose you're cleaning a really important tooth here and somebody hits you on the back while you're doing it. Suddenly you've got a risk to you. So what you're doing is looking at the effects and the advantages and disadvantages and laying them out and beginning to make a choice about what's the best solution to a problem. So the Japanese solution is a really healthy solution, although the likelihood of our doing it is extremely small. So you have to, marry that in with that. So that was one thing I did. The second thing I referred to is what I call being in the moral zone. And what I mean by that is just like a basketball player, when somebody's in the zone, everything goes right. You don't know what you're doing, but all the baskets go in, all the passes get done properly, and so on. When you're in the moral zone, no moral criticism catches on you. And at least three things have to be true in order for that to happen. And if you think of how we criticize people morally, you can see these three things. One excuse we give when we do something that hurts somebody else is we say, I didn't intend to do that. And what's that mean? Intention counts morally. If you don't have the intention to do harm, in certain situations, but not in all, then that gets you off the hook. So if you're going to have space for moral criticism, what you want is somebody who's evil. Let's take an example of somebody who's perfectly evil, who intends to do really bad things, but he's a klutz. And when he does it, he does something that's good instead. Well, you want to give him credit because he did something that was good. On the other hand, he didn't intend to do good, so you want to criticize him for not, so that's one thing you're looking at, the motivation, as it were. Second thing is you're looking at the character of the person involved. If a bad character does something good, we want to praise the bad character for having done something good. On the other hand, there's always that residual, why did he do that? Is he trying to suck us in some way? Or is this a real change of heart? So we want a good character. And the third thing we want is we want the effects to be more beneficial than harmful. And that's a long conversation about what effects are taken into account and which ones aren't. But clearly the readily predictable effects are important. So if somebody good, of good character, intends to do good and succeeds in doing good, there's no room for moral criticism. But if any of those three are missing, then we have room for moral criticism. So I'm a polyglot, as it were, in regard to moral theory. I think there are a bunch of three different standards at least that we appeal to in normal circumstances, and that's how we assess things. Does that help?
It does a little bit. I mean, when you're answering the question, you're saying have good intentions and...
Yeah, no, I know. A little begging the question, isn't it?
And also, in the context of your story, the independent standards would have suggested that she reported to the authorities.
Right.
And that be what...
Well, those are the
independent standards.
Those are the legal standards. She was asking what she morally ought to do. She knew that if she didn't do it, she'd be doing something illegal. All right.
Legal and immoral or not.
They're not the same. That's right. And part of the reason here is, when you think about what's happening, part of her reasoning was, if this was an accident, and they seemed very surprised by even the possibility of this occurring, and the husband was as upset as the wife was. So he's either a very good actor or it was an accident, all right? So if they didn't do anything wrong, they're going to pay a huge penalty because she's going to go to the law, and the law has to act in the way it's going to act. So one of her dilemmas was, should I report it or not? If I report it, that's legally what I ought to do, but it may not be morally what I ought to do. Let her finish her. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to tie it back to the challenger really quick.
Oh, okay.
And one of the arguments you made was that the challenger exploded because he took off his engineering hat, right? And so by taking off her social worker hat and not allowing the legalese to sort of be the independent standard, I'm just not sure how those are.
I don't think she took off her social work hat. I mean, as a social worker, she's obligated morally to do the best she can for her clients, and those were her clients. So she's trying to figure out what's best for them, whatever that may end up meaning. But at the same time, she's legally obligated to report this. So one of her problems was, if I don't report it, I'm doing something that I could be charged with by the law. But going immediately saying, I just do what the law tells me to do, that's not taking off your social work hat. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm ready for you now.
My question was about the social worker.
Oh, okay, all right, okay, good. She wasn't actually wearing a hat any of the time, but do you want to know what she did?
Yeah.
I was stunned. We were actually a part of my person I was working with as a social worker. We were actually part of this. We didn't take part in it, but we paid attention to what was going on, and she called us up and asked for advice because she'd heard we were doing this kind of stuff. And so we talked it through, but let her act on her own. I'm not a social worker. And here's what she did. The baby was declared dead at about 6 o'clock on Friday. It's 40 on Friday. It's 48 hours. So it was brain dead. And so you do a test, did an EEG, it was flat on Wednesday night. They did another one on Friday night, late Friday afternoon. It was also flat. Officially, she's dead. So a doctor is required to file a death certificate within 48 hours in Michigan of the date of the time of the death. But it's Friday. It's 6 o'clock on Friday. You think the doctor is going to wait till Monday morning to do this, or Sunday afternoon at 6 o'clock? No. He's going to do it right then and there. Get it done, it's over with, and he's home. So she knows that if he signs the death certificate, which says Sims on it, because he still thinks it's Sims, he'll be signing a false death certificate, a death certificate with false information. That's a criminal offense. And she will be party to that. So she tells him what happens and basically says, you decide whether to call the law or not. And you want to know what he did? He signed the death certificate, wrote down Sims, and went home. So, another question whether what he did was right or not. But she basically got herself off the hook. She got herself off the hook by hooking somebody else. Yes?
So I'm sorry, just to clarify, she went to him and said, if you sign off that this is SIDS and it wasn't, that's illegal, and now you know that, so
that's right.
It's like definitely illegal.
That's right.
Or something.
That's right.
So I'm just going to tell you that, and then if you write SIDS, then I'll call the law.
No, she didn't say she'd call the law. If you write SIDS, you now know that that's not the cause of death.
Okay.
And you're doing it knowing that it's not the cause of death, and you're subject to a criminal penalty. I'm not going to do anything. That's up to you to decide now what to do. So she's saying to the doctor, you can call the law in, or you can sign a death certificate that has false information on it. It's your choice.
So if he had written that it wasn't SIDS, and that it was, the father falling asleep, then the law would have been called in?
That would have been called in. Yeah, it would look more like homicide. So he wrote SIDS, and that was the end of it. And I have no idea what happened to the family. I don't know what happened to the family. Other questions? Yes, Jacob.
So this is a really question, but when you're sort of explaining the joke of the engineer, you talked about the engineer not having an objective perspective on the situation. And I thought, well, that's kind of funny. I mean, because he looked at the blade and said, so it seemed fairly objective to me that I'm an engineer.
There you go.
So I guess, could you comment on what would constitute an objective perspective, whether in that situation or in general?
Oh boy. Okay, so what you want me to do is explain what it would be like to make an objective judgment in this case, in this kind of case, right?
And maybe you can't.
I'm not sure that I can actually do that. It's one of my areas of interest, but I don't know that I've actually got an answer to it. I can say a couple things about it. One, as you would expect, I'm a philosopher, so of course I have something to say about it. It strikes me that one of the things that bothered me about the line, you should look to your inner compass, is that somehow that's sort of self-verifying, and that it also means you're not really looking at other people to see what they think about what it is that you're doing. So one of the hardest things to do when you're involved in an ethical problem, and you're part of the problem itself, is to look at this from somebody else's point of view. Because you're self-interested in this. I mean, the problems people are going to have in business, for example, almost never involve other people. They involve you, okay? You're going to be part of the issue here. That's why you have the problem here. So one of the things you do is you talk to the other people who are involved in the problem and see what they think about this. You basically walk yourself through all the viewpoints that are possible to have on this, and you get advice from people. And the advice they give you may in fact be skewed by their own perspectives, all right? But when you're done, you'll have a lot of perspectives, and you'll have a much richer understanding of what the problem is than you would have had before. So that's one way to get yourself, as it were, out of your skin, is to get the skin of other people involved in what it is that you're doing. And I think that's very hard for people to do. It's partly hard for other people to articulate what it is that they see about a problem. But if you can learn how to do that, and that's a skill, to get other people to talk about what they see as wrong or right about the situation in question, take notes, end up with a bunch of different perspectives on this, you'll end up being able to make a better decision, at least in the sense that even if it's the same decision you would have made otherwise, you now have reasons for it, which are reasons you wouldn't have had if you went on your gut, as it were, or your conscience. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's partially satisfying.
Yeah, well, it's only partially satisfying because you're going to end up with disputes that don't look like they're solvable. And the disputes are going to be of the form, for example, what constitutes due care? So when I first did the experiment with social workers, how many would let their children sleep, their infants sleep in their bed? I was stunned by the response. Basically a 50-50 split. I was even more stunned by the conversation. These were social workers, after all. And I started asking them why, and they got into this incredibly confrontational discussion about how terrible each person was not to sleep with your baby and to sleep with your baby. And I had to basically calm people down and say, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about this. Let's not yell about it. And let's find out what your reasons are and see if we can work it through. So you're going to have disputes, for example, about what constitutes due care, which aren't going to be easy to answer. And you're also going to have people looking at things in ways it never would have occurred to you to look at it, like this. I had never seen this as a boat. It had never occurred to me. But I can see now how you might see it that way. It had never occurred to me it was a pencil. Although I can sort of see now, but I would have said a pen, something to deliver ink to the 12 is something you squeeze to deliver ink to it or something. But again, I hadn't thought of it in this way. So each time you're talking something through with somebody, you're going to get perspectives that enrich your understanding of what the situation is. And that will allow you to make a better decision, presumably. Whether it's completely objective, that's another question. It sort of depends on who you're talking to, what kind of conflict you've got. Other comments, questions? Are people, you're putting on your coats because it's time to go?
Oh, no, I was just chilly.
You're chilly? Oh, okay. Okay, yes.
So I was curious about when you know someone else's perspective and then intentionally throw it out, and how you can justify that, knowing that the one doing this analysis has kind of rose-colored glasses, if you will. So if I have a perspective on the morality of what I'm doing, and then I look at it from your perspective, and basically I say, okay, you have different assumptions that you base your life on, so I'm actually going to disregard your perspective as not going to influence my decision. I respect that you think the way you think, but I'm not going to take that and influencing my decision. What are the things that you need to do to truly justify throwing out that perspective?
You need to do what I do when I get in discussions that really irritate my wife and my children, which is, what are your premises? I mean, you've really got to come to grips with the argument the other person has, even if they're not aware of the argument they're giving. And that can be quite an enterprise, because they may have a gut reaction to what you're doing. Oh, no, you can't do that. And then you ask them why, and it's like, well, because, well, because is not a reason. You have to begin to articulate the reasons and figure out why it is that they think what you're doing is not the right thing to do. And that ends up forcing you to articulate the reasons why you think what you're doing is the right thing to do. Now, if this person's involved in what it is that you're doing, that gives them a special status. They're not just an observer, they're a participant. And so you've got to pay attention to them. They have standing in a way that I would not have standing, for example, because I'm an outsider. But if they're part of the situation, you have to pay attention to them. And if you can't just blow them off, because that's not treating them as a rational human being. You're obligated to listen to their reasons, and if you can, if they don't have very articulate ones, coax the reasons out of them. I always presume, people have good reasons for doing what they're doing. That presumption's false so many times, it gets depressing. But that's the presumption you make when you're trying to pull the reasons out of somebody as to why they're doing what they're doing. They have a different vision, a different way of looking at something. Your job is to figure out what that is and to match it up against yours. It may turn out that when push comes to shove, you have a basic disagreement on a basic agreement on the main premises, and it's just a minor difference. On the other hand, it may be a major difference, and then you've got to really articulate your reasons for doing what you're doing. The way to think about this, the analogy I use is the development of the common law. How it is that the judges decide cases and build up case law over a period of time. They make a decision and they give reasons for their decision. And then a new case comes along. And it's a little different from the case that they already decided. So they can't just decide it the same way. They've got to figure out in what way is it similar to the case they just decided and what way dissimilar. And if it's dissimilar enough, they're going to have to give a different set of reasons. And over a period of time, somebody can read through all of these cases and get a really clear picture of what the animating principles are. How it is that judges have decided that these are the principles that ought to make a difference in deciding this kind of case. So as you run through the people who are involved in the problem that you've got, and you begin to articulate the reasons, you may see some common threads emerging. And that's going to be really helpful, because those begin to articulate principles that make a difference and should make a difference to your decision. I mean, I don't mind if you blow me off, but if you're involved with your neighbor in some dispute, you can't blow him off. You got to settle it in some way, reasonably, that is. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. It's frustrating because it takes a lot of time. On the other hand, it creates a relationship of unbelievable importance, because two of you have come to grips with a common intellectual problem and have at least resolved the differences between you, that is, figured out what the differences are, and in some cases actually solved the problem. So it changes your standing vis-a-vis one another. Someone else had a question? Yes?
One part of your argument that I find maybe unsettling is that...
unsettling? Is that
yes,
what you... Okay.
Yes. Is that on one hand, learning what other people are doing is going to strengthen our argument because we'll be in a safer place with the majority, and I can see how in some instances that could lead to a better decision. But at the same time, I think a lot of scenarios where aligning yourself with the majority would be maybe not wise. You could end up with this groupthink mentality that would lead to a worse answer, or had you gone through and done an analysis yourself. And at the same time, I can think of scenarios where settling on the standard answer would be to accept a less good but mediocre answer where everyone else is. So how do you go and then look at what the majority is doing and then say, well, this is a scenario where I want to align myself with that because I want to be safer and on the side of the majority. Right. And then how do you say, well, I realize what the majority is doing here, but I want to go as far away from that as I can because my answer is better in these ways, and here's how. Question, sorry. What did I say that made you think I was
committing myself to going with the majority. I must have said something.
Well, not one way, but when you were speaking earlier to Andrew, you were discussing that that a useful tool in establishing independence would be to find out what other people are doing. And I'm not arguing that that would be the way to do that, but once you do that, how do you then find, well, this is what I'm going to do with that information?
Oh, I see. No, I wasn't meaning that you would end up agreeing with the majority here. It's not a vote. it's not as though we take a vote.
I know you wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking of that as well. That's why I used the legal example. What you're doing is trying to figure out whether the other person has principled reasons for doing what for having the view that they have about what it is that you're doing. I'm assuming he's got a moral problem of some sort, all right? I don't know that you do, but suppose he has a moral problem of some sort. And there are a couple of people in this room who are involved in that moral problem. And now he has to decide what to do. Just take a simple sort of example. He knows that somebody's cheated on an exam, right? He happens to know this. And several other people happen to know it. And it turns out it didn't make any difference. The person didn't do any better or worse than they would have done if they hadn't. They would have gotten an A anyway, as it turns out. We know this by hypothesis. So what does he do? Well, he talks to several other people who are involved because they wouldn't have gotten an A. They would have gotten an A if this person hadn't gotten an A, for example. So what do? Well, you talk to them and you figure out what the principles are which are justifying, or these people think are justifying their views, which are in this case opposed to your views or in support of your views. And now you look at the principles and you determine whether or not you can give reasons for acting on those principles or not. And that's not necessarily to go with the majority. That may be very counter majority. It may be that you decide that the majority is just dead wrong here and that we should do X, not Y, even though the majority thinks we should do Y. But you have to have reasons for it. And you have to have good reasons. And good reasons means you can't anoint them when you give them necessarily as good, but they will meet the test of time. That is, people will criticize them, and they will still end up standing. And that's something you'll learn over time. So that's how we push the envelope of, particularly in moral change, is we start giving reasons, and we start pushing. And sometimes those reasons are completely unacceptable to the people you're talking to. So I'm old enough to have lived through the 60s, the revolution in the 60s, where African Americans did their sit-ins. And I had an aunt, Aunt Sarah, who, bless her soul, she was a very nice aunt. But I can remember when I was probably this high, I was about 5 years old, I went camping with her. She took us, each of the nephews, she took camping individually. And so I was camping with her, and she took us canoeing and so on. And I went to get a drink of water, and she said, "You can't drink there. That's for colored people." And I actually had never heard this before. Okay, this is brand new to me, all right? It's like, what do you mean for colored people? I looked at this thing, and there was two fountains. One had colored over it, and the other had white only. And they had a single thing of water coming up, and then the water was split. And I'm going, if they drink special water, they're getting screwed, because this is the same water. I mean, I literally was thinking, there must be something wrong here, because she's saying this water is only for the colored people, and so it's got to be special in some way, but it looks the same to me because it's coming from the same pipe. And so I, as a little kid, started asking this question, and my aunt just got really upset at me and told me I could not drink out of that fountain. I had to drink out of the other fountain. It's like, okay. I had no understanding of what was going on here. Now, what was I doing? I mean, I don't want to give myself credit as a 5-year-old, but I was a different generation. My family never made that distinction. We never talked that way. We never treated people that way. And so when she did it, I was stunned. I had no idea what was going on here. And if you look at the world now, it's a radically different world than it was 50 years ago. It's radically different in terms of racial relations. It's not where it should be, but boy, has it changed. And so the move, what my parents were doing was pushing a moral envelope. And if they had been articulating that, they would have been attacked by every single one of their relatives. My mother was from Eastern Shore, Maryland, which is slaveholding property. And nobody there had anything to do with the colored. That was just a horrible thing. But she didn't have those beliefs, and she didn't act on them, and she certainly didn't teach them to me. I wish she'd taught me a little bit so I wouldn't have been so surprised at my aunt, so I would have known what to say. But what's happening there is, I think the majority, at least the majority of whites, would have said, no, there's this distinction. But some people didn't. You push the envelope, and things get changed. But they had reasons for doing what they're doing. And the reasons is, color makes no difference. You're all persons. You're all human beings. It's as arbitrary a contingency as eye color, hair color, or any other difference. They wouldn't have said it that way, but that's what they were doing. Yeah?
So, whose responsibility would you say it is to push the moral envelope in Arizona right now?
In Arizona?
Like, yeah, in response to SB 1070?
Well, I think it's actually every citizen's responsibility to push the moral envelope. Every single one of us who can do it. Can you send money? I mean, I did.
Do you think that's pushing the moral envelope?
I don't know. It depends on who you send it to, I guess. that would make a difference. It strikes me that I don't even know where to begin with this. You're a citizen, presumably you're a citizen of the United States?
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, I don't know. I can't tell by looking anymore. So you're a citizen of the United States. You have a birth certificate?
Yes, I do.
Is it real?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. So I just don't want to be a birther in regard to you.
I was born in the UK, though.
Oh, there you go. I knew there was a ringer involved here, so ha, ha, ha. But you had American parents? Is that what happened?
Yes.
Okay, at least one American parent. Okay. I suppose you can be president. I don't know. But somebody's going to ask. You're going to get pushed on this. It strikes me that we all have this obligation. Some people are better positioned to act on it than other people. I mean, you're not in Arizona. You're here, right? And it makes it much harder for you to have an effect in Arizona. But you can speak up. You can do things which have an effect, have some effect. I'm being represented by a representative who does not at all express my values. And so I tell her that every day. She gets an email from me each morning saying, yesterday you voted for so-and-so. That was really stupid. Because, and then I give a very quick reason. I'm sure I'm on her shit list, and I've got to be. But I don't care. It gives them something to do, and at least I'm getting her to know that this is not anything I accept. And I'm giving her moral criticism. I'm not just saying you're doing what's wrong. I'm telling her why she's doing what's wrong. So there's something we can do. I mean, as the last election showed, it matters whether you vote. As Wisconsin found out, it makes a huge difference whether you vote. So you've got to become an active participant in the political process. And that means informing yourself, discussing things, making the right decisions, although we often don't know what those are. Does that sort of answer your question? Or, I mean, it diffuses the responsibility, which is always a problem.
Well, I'm also thinking about the the ethical responsibility of legislators in Arizona as well as U.S. citizens there, and if you take the case of passing that law, would you say that legislators didn't consider their moral responsibility when they were making it or passing that law? And I guess in terms of making an ethical decision, I mean, what do you do when like you yourself want to accomplish something, but obviously, like you were talking about compromises before, so some people on the more radical end of the spectrum want to act in a certain way, whereas like other people think the law is okay and great and don't want to do anything, and some people think that we need to like assimilate, immigrants into our culture. Like I just think that with the variety of opinions there, like what you're talking about in terms of ethical responsibilities and decisions, like gets a lot. Depending on who you ask about that law, like I don't know where the independent standard there would lie.
Okay. Well, let me talk a little bit about, you mentioned politicians. What you're doing is talking about role morality. You're talking about the morality of particular roles that people have. So if you're a lawyer, you have a certain role that you're playing. And there are built-in constraints about what you can do and built-in obligations about what you ought to do, built into the role. So there's a wonderful joke that it's a man who's actually writing about arguments for the existence of God, and he's objecting to the cosmological argument. And he says, you don't need to know what it is, but what he's saying is, it's a really stupid argument. And it's stupid in the way in which this would be stupid. A doctor says, look, I can't cure you with medicine. So if you'll come with me, I'm going to hang you in a smokehouse. So you can be cured one way or the other, okay? Now, that's not the role of I know it's a perverse joke. That's not the role of a doctor, to cure you come what may in any way, shape, or form. That's not what a doctor's supposed to be doing. So there's a wonderful book, I'm going to mess up, 1810 Brisbane, the stuff on the duties of the various positions in England. Do you know that? No. It's a huge book that I've just finished going through. What he does, he talks about all the duties of everybody, every role that people play. So he talks about the duty of the king, the duty of the monarch, the duty of the members of the House of Commons, the duties of the House of Lords, and so on. And I have been struck by a failure on the part of, unfortunately, too many politicians not to tell the truth. And it's not as though they're lying, it's that they're not checking what it is that they're saying to determine whether what they're saying is true or false. And I'll pick such a soft example, I feel sad in picking it. But Representative Bachmann, the woman from Minnesota, is that her name? Bachmann? Michelle Bachmann. Who let it be known that Obama's trip to India was costing $4.5 million a day or something like that. This was a rumor she picked up from somebody who picked it up from an Indian paper that had no source whatsoever for it. And here she is, she's an elected official, she's on national news, and she's repeating this. This is outrageous. And part of the reason it's outrageous is people will believe her. And she has an obligation at least to check her facts. That's part of her job as a legislator. So the fact that she thinks that Paul Revere was writing in New Hampshire instead of in Massachusetts is no big deal, okay? You would want her to have a little more understanding of history if she's going to be running for president. But the fact that she says something false without checking it out, that is a problem. So I actually think legislators have obligations that are connected to the roles they play as legislators. And part of it is getting their facts straight. And part of it is not informing the public of things that are false. And that doesn't mean not lying. Of course they shouldn't lie. But it means checking out what they're saying to know whether or not there's any evidence for it. So Arizona, that's a little more complicated. They're making some value judgments here about how to handle the problem that the federal government has not been handling well. I think there were better ways of going about doing what they ended up doing, putting pressure on the federal government. I would never have voted for this. But if you look at it as a pressure, a piece of political theater to put pressure on the federal government, it was very effective. So is that what they had in mind? I doubt it, but it actually has that effect. So maybe something good will come out of it. Was there another question? Yes.
Yeah, with the example that you gave about because you have to push the moral envelope.
Yeah.
But in the case of everyone has their own values, right?
Right.
And if the majority of the society, you know, for instance, hates colors, and you're one of the few who doesn't.
Right.
So in that sense, if you do go outside and ask people what their ideas are on what you should do, you're going to get, you should not like colors.
That's right. Exactly.
So in that case, if you don't listen to your inner compass, where do you get the strength to move on with those values?
No. What you're doing is you're getting answers from people, and then you're asking them why. And what's the justification for treating these people differently? What's your reason for it? Now, if you look at the hate groups in this case, out of New Orleans in the 1960s, they were right on target. What they were saying was, blacks are inherently stupid and lazy. And that's why they're at the bottom of the heap. And so, okay, that's your argument? So what we need to do is to show you that on average, blacks are as intelligent as whites? Will that work for you? And can we show you that blacks are inherently as productive as whites? Will that do? Because that's empirical evidence we can actually provide. And if that will work, then that undercuts your argument. And so you have no leg to stand on. At least you don't have those legs to stand on. So, okay, we've taken care of those. What other reasons do you have? That's the move you make. You don't go to your inner compass. You go to the factual base and the principles that justify the claim that's being made, and you ask whether or not that's a justifiable position to take.
Well, but at the time, I'm sure they had cases, they used cases, for instance, saying, okay, based on the study that we've done, blacks are not known by empirical evidence to be inferior in some way. And they used science in that manner as well. So how would you logically be able to argue against?
Yeah, it's hard.
Cases on both sides.
Yeah.
Scientific evidence
Right.
on both sides. It's kind of hard to argue in that case.
Yeah. Boy, I don't know how deeply to go into this. Do you know Stephen Jay Gould's The Measure of Man? It's a really nice book. And what he does, he talks about the way in which, among other things, he talks about the measurement of IQ, intelligence. And part of what happened in the 19th century was that they took skulls and they measured the size of them by putting basically BBs in them. You know, fill it up with BBs, and then you see how many BBs you get in. Well, it turns out, the way the studies were done, blacks can't carry as many BBs in their head as their skulls as whites can, which means whites have bigger brains, which means, they're more intelligent. And what he tries to do, and I think succeeds in doing, is showing how these were flawed, how these experiments were flawed. But if you were living at the time, these are reputable scientists, reputable in the sense they hold positions in institutions of higher education, which are perfectly good institutions of higher education. You'd have to find a different ground. And you can. I don't say there's any problem finding a different ground. For example, it strikes me that the one way of thinking about intelligence is it's a bell curve, as almost everything is. And so there are going to be some very, very bright people at one end and some very, very stupid people at the other end. Now, is there a bell curve for whites? And if there is, it means there's some really stupid whites. Now, are the stupid whites more stupid or less stupid than the blacks, than the most intelligent blacks? Well, geez, that's pretty easy to answer. It would seem that they're probably just as stupid or as close to being just as stupid. It'd be really amazing if the bell curves for the two were completely separated from each other. And if that's the case, stupidity can't be the basis, because you would have as much reason for castigating stupid people who are white as you would for castigating blacks. So you can't do it that way, because people wouldn't agree. It's a racial thing. It's black versus white. So they must have some other reason for doing it. And you'd have to find out what the reason is and attack it.
Well, for instance, okay, so with another example, abortion or anti-abortion. In that case, how would you decide who's right and who's wrong? They diabolically oppose each other.
Yeah, they certainly do.
You're a murderer, or no,
Right.
I have pro-choice,
Right.
or life. It's two opposing sides. I mean, logically, you can't explain that it's okay or not okay.
I think actually there's quite a lot you can do to get clarity on that. I mean, I won't do this particularly now, but the one argument you could give is that if you're going to be consistent and you're going to be anti-abortion, then you should never, ever allow abortion. In the cases of rape, in the cases of a father impregnating a daughter, in the case of a father impregnating a daughter who's 10 years old, no abortion. It doesn't matter how the fetus was caused to come into existence. Once it comes into existence, it's there. And that's a really tough line to hold. It's a very difficult line to hold because you're basically condemning children. I'm thinking of a Grand Rapids case of a 10-year-old child who was impregnated by her father who was forced to go to term because the court would not hear her case until it was too late. Just kept putting it down the dock. He was an anti-abortion judge until it was too late to have an abortion. And so here you got a 10-year-old being forced to have her father's child and all the harm that comes from that to her body. It's not fully developed. Potentially to the child because you've got inbreeding here. It's hard to bite that bullet, and yet that would seem to be the implication of holding that because it's a fetus, it's a person, and therefore you can't abort it. So I think you can gain some agreement about some things, and once you begin to gain that agreement, at least you can get a middle ground somewhere. You're not going to solve this problem, I don't think, anytime. You're certainly not going to solve it before, is it 5 p.m. tomorrow or midnight tomorrow? When the budget has to be, yeah. You're not going to solve it before the government shutdown is coming tomorrow. You're not going to solve the abortion issue. But you can solve a lot of problems by talking it through and finding out what's motivating this and what are the implications of the principled positions that people hold. And I suspect some people won't continue to hold their principled positions. If you are pro-abortion and you hold, for example, as some of my students do, that the fetus is part of your body and you can do anything you want to with your body, then you're in the weird position of saying, as the baby comes out, it's all right to hack it off bit by bit. Because it's still part of your body, right? Even though it's trying to get out, it's still there, so that's okay. And it's like, whoa, that's pretty late abortion. And I can't imagine anybody adopting that view as an acceptable view on how we should handle abortion. It's much less dangerous doing it that way than it is actually having an abortion because the baby's coming out already. But, geez. So that position that because the baby is part of my body, I therefore have complete control over it, I don't think is a viable position. That's not the reasons for, that's not a good reason for being pro-abortion. Yeah.
So one of the challenges is that even if you can philosophically come to an understanding of an argument, most people don't like it.
That may be the case, yeah.
And I'm sure you can probably attest
Yeah,
to that.
no, I absolutely agree. So it's, go ahead, sorry, ask your question.
Even if it feels good to be right, like philosophically right, but then what do?
You do what she should be doing, which is sending money to Arizona. No, if you're... Oh, God. She may be doing it already. That's good. Here's, I mean, what you're saying is it's nice to have the correct position, but instantiating that correct, actually making it real, requires an enormous amount of work. Well, yeah, it does. Part of what you're doing is you're working in a system that already is in existence. So think about changing the attitudes. How many of you in here smoke? Anybody willing to admit that they smoke? Oh, you got 2 smokers? That's it? That's all? Oh, that's great. I'm glad. You guys got to quit. It really is bad for your health. It's just terrible. If I had asked that 40 years ago, 20 years ago, over half the room would have raised their hand. People smoke. The attitudes toward smoking have changed dramatically. It's just been stunning. And you go to Europe. How many people have been to Europe? Okay. How many people have been to Belgium? Okay. How many have sat in a non-smoking train car in Belgium? Okay, there are no non-smoking. There are ones that are marked non-smoking, but there are no non-smoking train cars in Belgium. Everybody smokes in them. It makes no difference what the signs say. It took a long time to go from the realization that secondary smoke is harmful to a change, a cultural change, which allowed us, other people, to say, you shouldn't be smoking in here, and have people pay attention and not smoke in here. So it's a long process. Part of it's cultural, part of it's political. And the part of the difficulty you're working with is it's just like he's an engineer. What's your training? Computing. All right. Well, this makes some sense. It's a legacy problem. It's a problem of people come to new instrumentation with legacies that they've gotten from old instrumentation. So if you make too much of a change in the design, you're going to lose these people. You're going to throw them completely off. So this morning, without coffee, I'm trying to go downstairs in the Babson Center. Are you listening to this, by the way? Thank you. He should listen to this. I'm on the 5th floor. I get in the elevator. Remember, I have not had coffee. I look at the buttons. There are only 4 buttons. Okay, so there's not one for the 5th floor? Yeah, no, there's one for the 5th floor. There's one for the 4th floor. There's no 3rd floor. There's no 3rd floor button anyway. There's only a 2nd and a 1st, so I push the 1st. Nothing happens. So I push the 1st again, thinking, it's a delayed reaction if I push it enough times. No, the 1st one doesn't work. You can't get to the 1st floor. You can only get to the 2nd floor, which has a little star next to it, I noticed after I looked more carefully, which means it must be the lobby area. So I get on an elevator in a 5-story building. I'm missing 1 floor, and I can't get to 1 floor, okay? It's like, I learned very quickly because, I'm adept at doing this kind of stuff, but it threw me, okay? It wasn't dangerous, it just delayed me a little bit this morning from getting, and I'm still puzzled as to why there isn't a 3rd floor in the...
I'll explain it to you when we go back.
Okay, all right. Okay, that's where we put the recalcitrant students. But it's like a legacy problem in computing, and society is just like that. You've got people with habits of behavior that need to be changed, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's not necessarily going to happen in 1 generation because we pass these things on to our children. But it may happen in a couple generations. And once it does, you get the momentum going for a fundamental alteration in the way in which we relate to each other. But it can be a long, hard process. Think of homosexuality, homosexual marriage. We're in the middle of a revolution about this. And this would not have happened 10 years ago. If you were a politician and you were arguing in favor of homosexual marriage, that would be it. You'd be done. Career over. That's no longer the case. And that's a really quick change. That's happened very fast. It's unusual for that. So, yeah, it's hard to get an ideal and then get the instantiation, but that's part of the process. It takes a lot of work. She went out probably to call in her credit card number so she can contribute to the... Other questions? Yes?
So I think the thing you just brought up makes me think of thing you've been saying about like the inner compass not really being a good tool or a good metaphor. But like in the example of politicians speaking out in favor of allowing homosexual marriage, I would say that takes a fair amount of moral courage.
Yep.
And like to me, that sounds pretty straightforwardly like following their inner compass or like doing what they think is right, even though like it, you know, like their conscience tells them to do it, even though everything outside, like all the pressures tell them not to. Like, so where would you like place that in sort of idea that inner compass or that sort of thing doesn't?
I guess I'm puzzled by the reference to an inner compass. I mean, in this way, you're using it as a contrast to what other people tell you ought to be done versus what you yourself tell you to do. And it makes sense to me. But if you yourself decide that it's okay to have homosexual marriage, you should have reasons for this. What are your reasons? And you should be able to articulate those. And I should be able to look at them. And I should be able to determine whether or not they're good or bad. They can't be esoteric to you. They can't be things like, I like homosexual marriage. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't help me at all, okay, in order to take a position. But once you do that, you're no longer appealing to your inner compass. You're appealing to reasons. And what you're doing when you say it takes a lot of courage on the part, well, it does take a lot of courage on the part of a politician, but I would hope that the politician has a principled basis for making the decision that they've made. And what you're asking them to do is to stand on their principles. And that doesn't take courage. That just takes being who you are, somebody who stands on your principles. I don't think that's courageous at all. I think you'd be a pretty sad human being if you weren't able to do that. Now, have you internalized them? I would hope so. So in that sense, you're appealing to something that's internal. But my problem with the internal compass is it's the same problem John Stuart Mill had with conscience. People argue you appeal to your conscience to tell us, well, your conscience is an artifact. It's created by, you know, who you are, when you were born, where you were born, what kind of life you've lived. And it has no more standing than any other feeling you happen to have. None at all, morally. What matters are the reasons you give for the position that you take. So if you are willing to stand on principle, then articulate them. Otherwise, don't bother.